Okay, welcome to episode 1 of Stealing Things. Today we're going to be taking this image of a building and recreating it in 3D, including the sides. So I'm going to open it up in GIMP. I'm going to start with the clone stamp and just get rid of a few things that are in the way of the building. For the brick pattern, I'm using the intersections of bricks as the source point so that the pattern continues. So with that done, I'm going to drag some guides out along vertical or horizontal lines on the building, and then I'm using GIMP's lens distortion node, and I'm just playing with the two factors to try and counteract the lens distortion that's in the image. Now I'm hitting Shift T to bring up the unified transform, and I'm using this to warp the building into a rectangle. And just by dragging out guides without placing them, you get a rule that you can bring down the image and make sure that at each point along the top, middle and bottom, the horizontal lines are straight and the vertical lines are straight. And you can just check that the edges of windows and door frames are lining up. So once that's done, I'm going to crop in and then we can jump into Blender. So here we are in Blender. I'm going to set the origin point to the bottom and scale it up a little. Now the first thing I'm going to do is add some edge loops and just delete the outsides of the building, and then go into the UV editor and tweak the UVs so that they're perfectly mapped on. So now I know that this is a perfect rectangle. And because we did that preparation at the start, it's now very easy to add edge loops, and they'll mostly line up with the top and bottom of windows. I'm going to separate the top and bottom half of the building because the window pattern on the bottom is different and there's also a door there. As I go through, I'm trying not to add edge loops unless I need to, so if there's edge loops already present, I'm going to edge slide them by double tapping G and only add new edge loops when I need to. Now that I've laid out all of the outlines, I can select all of the window ledges and extrude them out, and select all of the windows and extrude them in. Now for each window, I'm going to hit Y to separate the face, and then hit Shift H to hide everything but that face. Add some edge loops around the outside to define the outer rim and extrude this area in. Now I can define the insides here and extrude the individual panes back. And now there's another raised section, so I'm going to add 2 more loop cuts in the middle. Hit Ctrl B to bevel them and then extrude this cross shape out. In edge select mode, I'm going to deselect all these edges in the middle, give a little bit of bevel just to the outside to give it some rounder shape. Small details like windows will catch the eye more, so it's worth spending time to put this detail in. The image texture will hold it down for large areas like the walls, but if you can define the edges really well in CG, it'll make your model look a lot sharper. If you hit Y when you add new loop cuts here, they won't travel all the way up to the outside of the building. So your mesh will be non-manifold, which may be a problem for simulations and things, but you will be avoiding adding more topology. For these windows at the bottom, I'm going to adjust a few of them because the angle's slightly off. Same thing, just adding loop cuts to define an outer edge, and then in a windowsill, extruding bits back, and then I'm going to extrude the outside out, give another layer of detail. I'm going to remake this vent with a plane. Just subdivide it and bevel the outside corners here, delete the back faces, and then this is a mess inside, so I'm going to delete these and replace them with an n-gon. Now I'm going to add a circle in the middle, get it to about the right size and extrude it out. Now while we're here, I'm going to line the camera roughly to how it was in the original image and project it from view, and then line it up in the UV editor. Line the end cap up as well. Once we've done that, I can inset this and extrude it back in to give it a bit more depth. And then you can see the texture of the vent has been smeared onto the back. So I'm going to cut it in half with the knife tool. And then for the left side, I'm going to duplicate the texture from the right side and mirror it. So now we have one vent, we can copy it across to this window, and you can copy it and put it in other windows you want to that weren't on the original image. I'm going to make a duplicate of the building material, set the roughness to 0 and the metallic to 1, and this is going to be a glass material, so I'm going to assign that to all of the window panes. For the window and the door, I'm going to inset and then extrude back. There's not as much detail in this texture, but I'm going to make another frame inside by adding some loop cuts and then moving the texture coordinates so they line up with the edges. And now there's another layer of detail. For this ledge above the door, I'm going to use the knife tool to cut out this end, And then you can see it doesn't actually follow this straight line perfectly. So I'm going to isolate this and use double G to slide the mesh down and just isolate where the ledge is. I'm also double tapping G to slide individual vertices around. So now I can extrude just this ledge, go into edge select mode and deselect all except the top and bottom, and then give it a bit of bevel, and then again bevel the edges. Because we slid those edges down, we now have a gap between the top and bottom of the building, so I'm just going to extrude it down. And then for some areas like here, we're going to run into some problems because edges are overlapping. So what I'm going to do is merge these overlapping vertices and then manually reconstruct this face and this triangle. And we're going to have to reproject the texture so it matches. So I'm going to go to front view and project from view, and then select a couple of faces around so I can see in the UV view where to line up. Line up one point and put the 3D cursor there, and then set the pivot point to the 3D cursor and scale until the other end lines up. I'm going to edge slide these edges over to this door so they're properly outlining it. I'm going to add a loop cut to the top and then edge slide it up to the top. Now I can select all of these faces, hit Y to separate. I'm going to add a cube and delete the back face, line it up with where this hinge is. When you're working on an angle and it's a simple shape, you can use Alt S to move a face in the direction of its normal. So for this box I can hit Alt S on any of the faces to move it forward and backward. And then bevel the front and project it from front view. I'm going to select these faces, pop them out with Y and then move them forward, and then extrude the outside edges back in to raise the lip out a little bit. So I'm going to use double G to slide the points and edges around and outline all of the support beams that are inside the door and also around the edges of the door, reusing edge loops wherever I can. I'm going to move the texture on the bottom of the door to make sure I get all of the detail that's in the cracks. Once I've outlined all of the beams, I'm going to select them and extrude them forward a little bit. Then I'm going to switch to edge select mode, deselect all of the edges that are inside of this shape, and then bevel the outsides. I'm going to move on to some pipes. I'm going to add a circle, use the spin tool to rotate it out 90 degrees, and then just start extruding from the front view. And these points with junctions I'm just going to scale up and then carry on extruding. For corners I'm making a rough 90-degree turn and then adding one loop cut as a guide and beveling it to get a smooth curve. There's pros and cons to doing it like this. I'd probably do it with curves in future. For these pipes you can use Alt S to change the thickness. I'm going to make a simple tap with a little nozzle. And now, because I've made it once, I can duplicate it up here and then connect it to the rest of the pipes by extruding. These pipes aren't really connected, they're just intersecting. So onto the white pipes, it's the same method. I'm going to make a different material for this dark box. For the joints, I'm going to extrude and scale. I'm going to make a new material for the metallic pipes. I'm going to project from view in the front view and then use the same trick of lining up one point, putting the 3D cursor there, and then scaling it about the 3D cursor. And now the pipes have a metallic version of the image texture. I'm going to add a color ramp, but there's not that much detail in this texture, so I'm going to add something else. This is a noisy texture which looks suitably dirty. And then I'm just playing with the specular and the metallic and stuff. This stuff is not really physically accurate, but I'm just trying to get a good impression of the small pipes so that they react to light slightly differently than the rest of the wall. For the white pipes, there's not much point extracting the base texture, so I'm just going to go straight into finding an image texture, overlaying that on a base color so that I can control how much color variation there is, and also giving it a little bit of bump and roughness. For the roughness, I'm adding the texture into a base color. So by changing the base color's darkness, You can change how plasticky and reflective the pipes look as the base, and then by changing the factor you can control how much the dirt is affecting that roughness. So I'm going to get my materials organized. I make a copy of the base texture and just make it metallic. Select the door and assign this to the metallic version. And then I'm going to start by cranking the metallic slider to 1, and then using a color ramp on the image, I'm going to try and find the contrast points. Invert it so the dark parts are the roughest, which translates to these damaged areas. Take the black level and raise it quite a bit because we don't ever want it to be a perfect mirror. I'm not going below 0.5, and I think it's more like 0.6 to 0.7. I'm going to also assign the ledge to that metallic texture. And I've noticed that on the top of the ledge it's showing up as invisible, which means that there are no texture coordinates for those faces, so I'm just going to project from the front view again. I'm going to really quickly model this light. It's just a simple circle and extruding, project the texture onto the front. I'm going to add a Bezier curve, give it a little bit of depth, and give it a dark diffuse shader. So all of this detailing on the window has left us with some horrible texture stretching. For these windows, you can select the brick textures and just slide them to the side. If you keep it horizontal, the brick pattern will carry on around the corner. For some of the ledges, there just isn't enough texture detail in the original image to get a good amount of texture out of it, so I'm reusing some of the curb, or you can just reuse bits of the building. You have a fair bit of license to just do what you like because the texture is all from the same image. For the windows, for stuff around the outside, you can sort of unwrap it like a present. And for the inside faces, you can do them in a kind of batch where you select all the top ones, move them up, select all the left ones, move them left. And then for the window sills, if you've got a good window frame somewhere else on the image, you can easily just use those textures. The other thing is these windows have quite a bit of chromatic aberration. So I'm going to select all those windows and then in the UV editor set the pivot point to individual origins and scale them down just a little bit. If you have a low-res image that you're working from, or it's blurry or something, you can sometimes add back a bit of definition. For example, if you've got a blurry image of the window and the window sill is bleeding into the window itself, if you scale down the window so that there's no longer any overlap, and you do the same on the windowsill so it is just the windowsill, you've defined it in the 3D world better than it was defined in the image. So your model is going to look sharper than the texture that it's using. So you can add resolution back if you've only got a low resolution image to work with. Okay, I'm going to make brackets for these pipes. I'm going to start with a subdivided plane and add a shrink wrap modifier. I joined the pipes with the building for this so that I could just use one shrink wrap modifier and it would wrap itself to the building and the pipes. I'm going to add a bit of offset to the shrink wrap modifier and then add a solidify after that to give it some depth. One thing with this is because the pipes are so low poly and the brackets also low poly, you can get cases where the shrink wrap will not line up perfectly. I'd probably do this a different way in future. I would just model one bracket and then it's a case of just duplicating and rotating each one a slightly different amount and following what's happening on the image. So we've got a facade, but I want to make the sides of the building too. So I've got these two pictures which I took the top half and the bottom half of the side of the building. Unfortunately the bottom half has a car in it, but we'll deal with that. So I'm going to start with the top half because it's a bit easier. Like before, cancel out the lens distortion and then use Shift T and make sure that the horizontal lines are horizontal, vertical lines are vertical. And you want to be sure that you're checking the top and bottom of the image. If the top is fine and the bottom's not, you can adjust the skew. So now I'm going to go and do the same thing for the bottom. Once these images are both straight, I'm going to overlay it at 50% opacity and get the scale correct. My policy is usually to try and scale things up rather than down because I want to maximize the resolution at the start. I can scale it down at the end. And you can see that the scale is slightly wrong. And this is just a fiddly process of gradual refinement. We have an advantage here because of this ledge, so what I'm going to do is, when it's almost perfect, use this natural ledge as my dividing point between the top and bottom image. Okay, so we have half a building with a car in front of it. I'm going to duplicate the bottom half and slide it across and try and line up the brick pattern. I'm going to make this visible only in the areas where it's erasing the first car. And then we can use the clone brush to get rid of the rest of the car and gently blend in the brick texture. You can see the right side is actually quite a bit darker. So I'm using a wide feathered brush set to lighten, and I'm gently painting in against this shadow to brighten it up. So we have a complete side of the building. I'm going to crop this down, and then I also want to make a seamless version of this. For the seamless version, I'm just going to use the clone stamp to paint out the top where there's small bits of sky visible. You can also make a selection and transform that part of the image. Other things like this pipe here we don't want because that's going to show up way too obviously if we start tiling it. This coiled cable is also going to be a problem, so that's going to get cloned out. Instead of just offsetting the image, I'm actually going to duplicate it and slide it over. I don't want to use the whole range of this image. I think this stain here is probably a good spot to make the seam. So the most crucial thing is that the bricks line up. So I'm again using Shift T and making sure that at all points on the image the brick lines will match up between the two halves. So now we can start painting out the seam. For the bricks, it's just a case of painting left and right to try and break up this seam line. The lines between bricks are quite important, so frequently I'm putting my cursor directly on the intersection between bricks. In some cases you can paint the inside of a brick so that the mortar matches one side and the brick matches the other side. There's quite an obvious value difference between the two sides, so you can add a gradient and brighten up one side to smooth this out. Okay, so back in Blender, I'm going to start by importing that side image, and I can just line the height up with the building we've already made. Now I can add some loop cuts to the roof. I'm going to go into the UVs and just make sure they're all nicely lined up. I'm going to also move these over so the pipe isn't in the texture. Delete this face so it follows the shape. I'm going to grab the edges along the top and extrude them across. And then I'm going to add loop cuts to define the edge and extrude them out. A little bit of bevel to round them off. And then add a couple of loop cuts and move them around a bit to make it less even. I'm going to add some loop cuts to the ledge in the middle here. Double tap G on the vertices to make sure they line up properly. And again extrude it out and give it some bevel. Okay, so we have one side. I'm going to duplicate this and flip it for the other side. Now I'm going to import this seamless version of the texture. Now this seam is quite noticeable and I didn't flip it back to normal when I was making it seamless, so I'm actually going to chop it off halfway through, which puts it back to how it was originally. And then the drips kind of outline the panels of the building. Same thing, I'm going to add some loop cuts to define the ledges and the middle and the top. I'm going to add a roof by adding a plane. I'm just going to project a texture of some concrete panels onto it and line up the grime in the corners. And now for each of these panels I'm going to add some loop cuts and move them around a bit so that they sag in the middle. And to make the final render more interesting, I've added a large cube with the volume material. I've dimmed down the world lighting to the bare minimum. I've added an area light on the side to simulate those security lights that they leave on overnight. For the sun lamp, I'm turning it to a dark blue color and putting it on a grazing angle for some moonlight. And for the windows, I've added an emission texture of some offices at night. And we're done. We now have a building shell. You can put this in a group and append it to other scenes. I was going to build the front, but the front is actually completely different in style. It's like a shop front. So I will be making some shop fronts at some point, and I've collected a lot of good reference for that. In future episodes of Stealing Things, I'm going to go through just making a whole bunch of rooftop greebles and the vents and air cons that you tend to find on top of buildings. And once we've done that, we can come back to this and drop them in. So, thanks for watching. Let me know if there's something I missed that you want me to cover, and I will see you in the next one soon.